On a rain-swept hill in Simi Valley, California, a tiny frail figure stood draped over a mahogany casket. It was June of 2004, and the world was watching the final curtain call of a political dynasty. But for Nancy Reagan, the cameras, the dignitaries, and the pomp of a state funeral were merely background noise. Her world had effectively ended the moment her husband, Ronald Reagan, took his last breath a few days prior. She appeared shattered, a woman who had spent 52 years defining herself through the existence of another person, now left to navigate a terrifying void. To the public, she was the Iron Butterfly, the Dragon Lady, the fierce protector who had arguably wielded more influence than any first lady in American history. But as she stared at that flag-draped coffin, she was paying the ultimate price for that power. She was facing the one enemy she could not banish, the one scandal she could not spin, and the one tragedy she could not prevent. This is not just a story about politics or the White House. This is a story about an obsession so deep it bordered on pathology, a love so consuming it alienated children and friends, and a final, agonizing decade of isolation that reveals the true cost of living at the pinnacle of power. If you are ready to look behind the curtain of one of the most complex figures in American history and walk through the silent, empty halls of her final years, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to bring you these deep dive investigations into the untold stories of history. To understand the tragedy of Nancy Reagan's final years, we must first understand the architecture of the life that preceded them. Nancy was never designed to be a solo act. From the moment she met Ronald Reagan in the golden haze of 1950s Hollywood, she dedicated her entire existence to the construction of his image and the protection of his well-being. She was an actress of moderate success, but her greatest role, the one she would play until her dying day, was that of the adoring wife. This was not merely a traditional marriage of the mid-20th century. It was a fusion. They were often described by friends and insiders not as two people, but as a single entity. They wrote thousands of letters to each other. They never stopped holding hands. When Ronnie entered a room, Nancy's eyes would fixate on him with a look that became famous, known simply as the gaze. It was a look of total adoration, but also of intense scrutiny. She was watching him, but she was also watching everyone watching him. This intense codependency was forged in the fires of their early ambitions, but it was hardened into steel on a sidewalk in Washington, D.C. on March 30th, 1981. This is the moment that truly created the Nancy Reagan of history books, and it is the moment that planted the seeds for her lonely finale. When John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots in 1.7 seconds, he didn't just wound the president. He shattered Nancy Reagan's sense of safety forever. When she arrived at George Washington University Hospital, she walked into a scene of carnage and chaos that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. She saw her husband, the man who was her entire universe, pale and gasping for air, his suit soaked in blood, a bullet lodged roughly an inch from his heart. The trauma of that day fundamentally rewired Nancy Reagan's brain. Before the assassination attempt, she was a socially ambitious first lady interested in redecorating the White House and buying new china. After the shooting, she became a ferocious gatekeeper. She realized that the Secret Service, the staff, and the political advisors could not keep Ronnie safe. Only she could. This belief morphed into a controlling obsession. She began to dictate his schedule, not based on political strategy, but based on the astrological charts of a woman in San Francisco named Joan Quigley. If the stars said it was dangerous for the president to travel, the president did not travel. If the chart said a meeting should be canceled, Nancy made sure it was canceled. This era of her life, the 1980s, established her reputation as the bad cop to Ronald Reagan's good cop. She was the one who fired people. She was the one who held grudges. She took the heat, the criticism, and the mockery so that her husband could remain the amiable, sunny grandfather of the nation. She absorbed the darkness so he could stand in the light, but this transaction came with a heavy debt. By positioning herself as the ultimate enforcer, she isolated herself. She alienated key allies. She strained relationships with her own children, Patty and Ron Jr., who struggled to find space in a family dynamic that was entirely suffocated by the bond between their parents. Nancy's world shrank until it contained only Ronnie and the people who served Ronnie. She did not cultivate a life outside of him because, in her mind, there was no life outside of him. When they left the White House in January 1989, boarding the helicopter to fly back to California, Nancy felt a profound sense of relief. She believed she had done her job. She had gotten him out alive. They were returning to the wealthy enclave of Bel Air, to a sprawling ranch-style house on St. Cloud Road, ready to enjoy a golden retirement. They signed multi-million-dollar book deals. They traveled to Japan. They were American royalty. But the universe had a cruel twist waiting for them. The peace Nancy had fought so hard to secure, the safety she had obsessed over for 8 years, was about to be dismantled from the inside. It started with small things: a forgotten name, a repeated story, a confusion about where he was. At first, Nancy, like many spouses, engaged in denial. Ronnie was getting older. He was tired. He had survived a shooting and cancer surgeries. But the fog did not lift. It thickened. In 1994, 5 years after leaving the presidency, the diagnosis came down like a hammer blow. Alzheimer's disease. It was a sentence of slow erasure. For Nancy, it was the manifestation of her deepest fear. She could protect him from assassins. She could protect him from political rivals, but she could not protect him from his own biology. The announcement to the world was made in a handwritten letter by the former president, a poignant farewell that stands as one of the most graceful exits in public life. But once the letter was released, the doors of the Bel Air estate closed. The long goodbye had begun. And it is here, in the silence of that house, that the true price of power began to be paid. Nancy Reagan, the woman who had dined with queens and prime ministers, who had commanded the attention of the global press, became a nurse. She became a caregiver, and she became a prisoner of her own devotion. For 10 years, Nancy Reagan presided over the slow disintegration of the man she loved. The isolation was staggering. In the beginning, friends would visit. They would come for lunch or tea. But as the disease progressed, the visits became awkward. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, lost his words. He would smile, that famous, warm smile, but the recognition behind the eyes was fading. Friends, uncomfortable with seeing their hero in decline, stopped coming. The phone stopped ringing. The social calendar, once bursting with galas and state dinners, became a blank slate. Nancy refused to leave him. She rarely ventured out, terrified that he might need her, or that something might happen in her absence. She created a controlled environment, much like she had in the White House. But this time the enemy wasn't a gunman. It was the confusion and fear that Alzheimer's brought to her husband. She protected his dignity with the ferocity of a lioness. She strictly forbade photos. She screened visitors ruthlessly. She wanted the world to remember him as he was, vibrant and strong, not as the frail man shuffling through the hallways of St. Cloud Road. But this protection meant she had to bear the burden of his decline alone. There were nurses and Secret Service agents, of course, but the emotional labor fell entirely on her shoulders. She would sit with him for hours, holding his hand, watching old movies, trying to spark a flicker of recognition. There were heartbreaking moments that leaked out to the public years later. Moments where he would look at her with the polite curiosity of a stranger. He knew she was important. He knew he loved her, but he couldn't quite place who she was. For a woman whose entire identity was based on being Mrs. Ronald Reagan, being unrecognized by him was a kind of psychological death. It was a torture that went on for a decade. During these years, Nancy herself began to physically diminish. The stress of caregiving, combined with her own aging process, made her frail. She had always been thin, a size 2, but she became gaunt. Her eyes, always large and expressive, grew haunted. She lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, waiting for the inevitable end. The criticism of her past actions faded, replaced by a growing public sympathy. The Dragon Lady was gone. In her place was a grieving wife engaging in the longest, hardest vigil of her life. But as investigators and biographers were about to find out, this was only the tip of the iceberg regarding her suffering. The physical and emotional toll was compounded by complex family dynamics and the looming shadow of her own mortality. We still have the most chilling evidence of her isolation to uncover, and the details of her final, lonely decade after Ronnie's death are even more poignant. So stay tuned, and if you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of the First Lady, make sure you've hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. The death of Ronald Reagan on June 5th, 2004, marked the end of the long goodbye, but it was the beginning of a new, perhaps even more difficult, chapter for Nancy. When he finally slipped away after 10 years of silence, Nancy was 82 years old. She had spent the last decade in a suspended state of grief. Now, the object of her life's work was gone. The funeral week was a spectacle of national mourning. Nancy played her role perfectly. She was the stoic widow, leading the nation in grief. She escorted his casket from California to Washington and back again. She accepted the folded flag. She waved to the crowds. But those who looked closely saw a woman who was barely tethered to the earth. At the interment ceremony at the Reagan Presidential Library, as the sun set over the hills, she broke down. She kissed the casket, crying out, and for a moment the mask slipped. The control she had maintained for 50 years shattered. After the funeral, the crowds dispersed. The motorcade stopped. The cameras went away. Nancy Reagan returned to the house on St. Cloud Road, but this time, the silence was absolute. Ronnie wasn't in the other room. He wasn't sleeping. He was gone. This is the period of Nancy Reagan's life that is least understood and most heartbreaking. It is the story of the First Lady who survived. For the next 12 years, Nancy Reagan lived alone. The house that had been their sanctuary became a museum of memories. She kept his office exactly as he had left it. She kept his clothes in the closet. She would often go into his room and sit, just to be near the things he had touched. She reportedly spoke to him constantly, telling him about the news, the weather, and the gossip, keeping up a one-sided conversation to stave off the crushing loneliness. Her social circle had been decimated. Many of their contemporaries were dead. The glamorous Hollywood friends of the 1950s were gone. The political power brokers of the 1980s had moved on or passed away. Nancy made an effort to remain active, but her health began to betray her. She suffered a series of falls, a common and dangerous affliction for the elderly, but for Nancy, they were particularly devastating because she was so physically fragile. In 2008, she fell and fractured her pelvis. Later, she broke several ribs. These injuries limited her mobility and confined her even more to the house in Bel Air. Despite her frailty, she did not lose her political instincts. In fact, during these final years, Nancy Reagan became a different kind of power broker. She became the matriarch of the Republican Party, a figure that aspiring politicians had to pay homage to. Candidates running for president would make the pilgrimage to Bel Air to kiss the ring. They sought her endorsement, or at least her blessing. She received them in her living room, perfectly coiffed, dressed in her signature red, sitting stiffly in her chair. She was sharp, observant, and often critical. She was not afraid to tell them what she thought. She was particularly protective of Ronnie's legacy. She did not want his name used to justify policies she felt he would have disagreed with. She became a guardian of the Reagan flame, fiercely correcting those who tried to rewrite history. However, there was a shift in her ideology, or perhaps a reveal of her true pragmatism. Nancy Reagan shocked the conservative base of her husband's party by becoming a vocal advocate for stem cell research. This was a direct result of her experience with Alzheimer's. She believed that science held the key to curing the disease that had stolen her husband, and she was willing to break with political orthodoxy to support it. She lobbied President George W. Bush. She gave speeches. She used her name and her moral authority to push for funding. It was a reminder that Nancy Reagan was never truly an ideologue. She was a woman driven by personal loyalty and personal experience. If stem cell research could have saved Ronnie, she supported it. It was that simple. But these moments of public advocacy were rare interruptions in a life defined by quiet routine and solitude. Her relationship with her children remained complex. Patty Davis, the rebellious daughter who had written tell-all books and posed for Playboy, moved back into the picture. In a twist of redemption, Patty became one of her mother's closest companions in the final years. The shared trauma of Ronnie's long illness had bridged the chasm between them. They found a way to communicate, to forgive, and to be present for each other. It was a softening of the hard edges that had defined the Reagan family dynamic for decades. Ron Reagan Jr. also maintained a relationship, though the scars of the past were never fully erased. The family was united by loss, if not by warmth. As the years ticked by, reaching into the 2010s, Nancy grew weaker. Her eyesight failed. Her hearing diminished. She spent her days in her bedroom or the small sitting room, watching television, reading endless stacks of magazines, and waiting. She was not afraid of death. In fact, she welcomed it. She told friends openly that she missed Ronnie and that she wanted to go home to him. The concept of home had shifted. It was no longer the White House or the ranch. Home was wherever Ronnie was. She felt like she was lingering at a party after the guest of honor had left. The world outside continued to change. The Republican Party shifted in directions that sometimes baffled her. The tone of politics became coarser, less dignified than the era she remembered. She felt like a relic of a bygone age, a woman out of time. She watched the news with a critical eye, often shaking her head at the lack of decorum. To Nancy, the presidency was a sacred trust, a role that required dignity and grace. She felt that standard was slipping away. There were moments of joy, mostly involving old friends who were still alive, like Betsy Bloomingdale. They would have lunch, gossip, and reminisce about the days when they ruled Washington. But these gatherings were shadowed by the inevitable reality of their age. They were the last of a generation. They were the survivors of the American century, watching the sunset. In the final year of her life, 2015 leading into 2016, Nancy Reagan effectively shut down. She stopped accepting most visitors. She was tired. Her body, which had been disciplined and controlled for 94 years, was finally giving out. She had paid the price of power. She had endured the scrutiny, the terror of the assassination attempt, the ridicule of the press, the burden of the astrologer scandal, the heartbreak of Alzheimer's, and the crushing loneliness of widowhood. She had paid it all in full. On the morning of March 6, 2016, the end finally came. Nancy Reagan died of congestive heart failure in her sleep at her home in Bel Air. She was 94 years old. When the news broke, it wasn't met with the same shock as a sudden tragedy, but rather with a sense of completion. The long wait was over. She was finally going to be reunited with her Ronnie. The funeral preparations began immediately, and they followed a script that Nancy herself had meticulously planned years in advance. She was a woman of detail until the very end. She knew exactly what song she wanted, who she wanted to speak, and where she wanted to sit. She was to be buried next to her husband at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, on that same hillside where she had wept 12 years earlier. But as investigators and historians looked back at her life in the wake of her death, a more complex picture emerged. This wasn't just a story of a devoted wife. It was a story of a woman who exercised power in the shadows because her gender and her era did not allow her to exercise it in the light. She was a pioneer of the modern first ladyship, transforming it into a position of operational influence. She showed that the first lady could be a political advisor, a personnel manager, and a diplomat. She paid a heavy price for breaking that mold. She was vilified for doing things that a male chief of staff would have been praised for. We are approaching the final analysis of her legacy, the moment where we weigh the cost against the achievements. But before we reach the conclusion, there is one more layer to this story that often goes untold. The secrets found in her personal archives that reveal the depth of her anxiety and the true extent of her influence. These final details paint the most vivid picture of the woman behind the mask. If you're finding this investigation valuable, ensure you've liked the video so we can keep producing this content. Nancy Reagan's legacy is often simplified into 2 words: just say no. Her anti-drug campaign was the public face of her tenure, a simple slogan for a complex problem. But the archives and the retrospectives that followed her death revealed a woman who was far more intricate than a slogan. She was a woman driven by a terrifying need for control in a world that felt uncontrollable. In the days following her death, as tributes poured in from around the world, from the Obamas, the Clintons, and the Bushes, the narrative began to shift. The harsh edges of the Dragon Lady caricature were smoothed over by time and by the recognition of her strength. People began to understand that her toughness was a reaction to the extreme pressures of the presidency. She was the lightning rod. She took the strikes so the president didn't have to. The funeral itself was a bipartisan gathering, a rare moment of unity in a divided America. It was a testament to the relationship she had maintained and the respect she commanded. But the most poignant moment was not the speeches or the eulogies. It was the final interment. As her casket was lowered into the ground next to Ronald Reagan's, a heavy rain began to fall, much like the day of her husband's funeral. But this time, there was a sense of peace. The circle was closed. Nancy Reagan paid the price of power with her peace of mind, her privacy, and ultimately, her solitude. She lived the last 12 years of her life in a house that was too big, filled with memories that were too painful, missing the one person who gave her life meaning. But she did it with a rigid, unbreakable dignity. She never complained publicly. She never sought pity. She simply endured. Her life serves as a stark reminder that the White House is not just a seat of power, it is a crucible. It burns away the superfluous and leaves only the essential character. For Nancy, the essential character was loyalty. Absolute, unwavering, fierce loyalty. She was not a perfect person. She could be petty, she could be vindictive, and she could be controlling. But she loved Ronald Reagan with a ferocity that is rare in any era, and certainly rare in the transactional world of politics. As we look back on the final years of Nancy Reagan, we see a woman who was essentially waiting. The power, the glory, the controversies, they all faded into the background. What remained was a woman in a chair, looking at a photograph, waiting to hear a familiar voice. The story of Nancy Reagan is a tragedy, but it is also a love story. It is a story about the cost of devotion. It asks us to consider what we would be willing to pay to protect the person we love, and what we would do when that person is gone. Nancy Reagan paid the highest price. She gave everything she had, every ounce of her energy, her reputation, and her identity, to the service of her husband. And in the end, she paid the price of surviving him. Thank you for watching this full investigation into the life and final years of Nancy Reagan. The complexities of her life, from the Hollywood lights to the White House shadows, reveal a woman of immense strength and profound vulnerability. What are your thoughts on Nancy Reagan's legacy? Was she the villain the press made her out to be, or the hero her husband needed? Let me know your theories and thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next long-form story. But before we truly close the book, we must acknowledge the broader context of the First Lady role. Nancy Reagan changed the rules. Every First Lady who came after her, Barbara Bush, Hillary Clinton, Laura Bush, Michelle Obama, Melania Trump, Jill Biden, had to navigate the path that Nancy carved. They had to balance the public expectation of a supportive wife with the reality of being a political partner. Nancy showed the dangers of stepping too far into the policy realm, but she also showed the necessity of guarding the president's back. She was a cautionary tale and a blueprint all at once. In the quiet corners of the Reagan Library, where they now rest side by side, there is a letter on display. It is one of the many Ronnie wrote to Nancy. In it, he says, "I more than love you. I'm not whole without you." For 52 years, they were a whole. For 12 years, Nancy was a fraction, trying to function as a whole number. That struggle, that silent, private battle against the void, is the true story of her final years. It wasn't about politics. It was about survival. The rain that fell on Simi Valley that day in 2016 washed away the last of the Dragon Lady image. It left behind the reality of a human being who loved, lost, and endured. The price of power is high, but the price of love is higher. Nancy Reagan paid both. If you made it this far, you are a true fan of deep stories. We have many more investigations planned, covering the hidden lives of historical figures, the unsolved mysteries of the political world, and the true crime stories that shape nations. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss a single one. Until next time.